What a great venue. What a fabulous venue. And I understand that we're honored to be on the same stage as have appeared Snoop Dogg, Blues Traveler, Jimmy Buffett. And tonight,
which is why we're dressed like the Blues Brothers.
That's right. We're
basically.
trying to.
Does anybody have a hat or something? Go on, please, please.
Later tonight, the Silent Comedy of San Diego will be playing. So some of you may be staying for that. I don't know. But anyway, we have to get out at a hard time of 8:30. So let me start right in. And it's such an honor to interview you or talk to you today, Steve, for a lot of reasons. Some people in the audience may remember that years ago I actually was a National Public Radio correspondent myself. But more recently than that, I used to travel to Damascus in the late 1980s for ABC News. And I'd like to hear, just briefly, I'm going to tell you what I saw, and I'd like to hear how it looked different to you.
Sure.
Damascus in the late 1980s was not booming, but it was certainly a comfortable town. There was a sizable middle class. They were sophisticated people. And in fact, there were several sophisticated people assigned to me, it seemed. They tended to be Christians or sometimes Druze. They were very nice, cultured people, well-educated, interesting to talk to. They would always make just a little too much of a forceful point of their support for Hafez al-Assad, the Assad pair.
Sure. They probably knew somebody was listening to them.
That's right. And so there was an atmosphere you sort of felt of tolerance, but there was a slight underpinning of fear in the air. Those were peaceful days for Damascus. You've just been there. What was it like?
Extreme fear is a place to begin, I suppose. You get into Damascus these days by way of Beirut on a land route. It's a 2 or 3 hour drive. You can fly into the international airport, but flights are extraordinarily rare because of sanctions and other measures. You can't get a flight to and from Europe, for example. You could get a flight out of Moscow. There's supposedly a daily flight, but it's considered scary because the airport road is constantly fought over and has been blown up. So you go on this other route from Beirut, and there are soldiers all along the way. There are checkpoints, one checkpoint after another after another. You get intensively searched at the border, or we did anyway. They take away any of your equipment that they don't like. And then 100 yards into the country, you're stopped at another checkpoint, and another checkpoint, and another checkpoint. And then you get into the city of Damascus, a major metropolitan area where there are hundreds more of these checkpoints, which have slowed traffic, which I'm sure was never great, probably wasn't great in the 1980s, to an absolute crawl. And when you have a situation like that, you quickly begin learning things about the country. The first is there's a civil war on, and you don't know who you can trust. But the second indication to me is they're probably not sure they can trust their own army. That's why you have 10 checkpoints on the way in from the border. You're not sure if somebody might let something slip by one of those checkpoints. So you have another one, and another one, and another one. Then you check into a hotel. Many correspondents to go to a Four Seasons there. I'd heard it was filled with mukhabarat guys, intelligence guys, so I wanted to make it 1% harder for them to monitor me, and I went to a different hotel, which I was allowed to do. There are some countries where they wouldn't even allow you that. And I got put in an 11th floor room. And there is a stereotype, a not at all flattering stereotype about war correspondents who cover the war from their hotel. It's not generally a good thing to do. But when you're in Damascus, it's a practical thing to do because you hear explosions all day long, and you can go to your 11th floor hotel window and see which suburb is being bombed right now by where the smoke is rising. And then you can decide whether you want to go have a closer look, which we did on a number of occasions. It is a bizarre circumstance where the center city, including the president's office on this kind of mountain peak overlooking downtown Damascus, is massively, massively secured, and you are stopped all the time. But something I did not realize was how intensively the suburbs have been fought over. There are entire sections of this city, and we can talk about other cities in Syria as well, where rebels are in control. The government doesn't seem to have the force or the knowledge to quite know how to flush them out. I mean, urban warfare is extraordinarily difficult. And so what they tend to do mostly is stand back and periodically lob an artillery shell in or arrange an airstrike. And it's not even a constant bombardment. It's this kind of occasional artillery shell landing, meaning that if you're a civilian in that suburb, you have no idea when the house next to you is just going to blow up. You just have no idea when something is going to land. And that's what Damascus is like right now.
So there are pieces of the city that are not in the government's control, is that right?
I think that's reasonable to say. There are even so-called front lines here and there. There are armed groups that control large parts of suburbs, such as Duma and some others that we could discuss. But saying exactly who is in control of what is a really problematic situation in Syria right now. I also was able to spend some time in Homs. Many of you will recall that is one of the earliest cities where there was fierce fighting, where the American journalist Marie Colvin was killed while reporting from Bab Amr, which was a section of Homs. The government pacified Bab Amr, if you can call it that, by just destroying it. I mean, it is a devastated area with very few people living in it now. The government formally controls other parts of that city, but the way that they control the other parts of the city is they have checkpoints around them, and they're really kind of reluctant to go in. Those sections are not necessarily controlled by rebels, but they are filled with people who are not supporters of the government. And so you have this gray area, and you have people who you sense are going back and forth through these checkpoints, going back and forth across the lines. They are maybe fighting on one side, they may be fighting on the other side, they may be sympathizing with different sides. You hear about families where different members of the same family have different sympathies. It reminds me of my own study of the American Civil War, where you imagine a front line, but things really were a lot more porous than that. And that makes for an extraordinarily complex situation where people are extraordinarily careful about what they say and what they do, but there's only so much care you can take.
Was it your impression, as you met people, and you say you managed to get to some families and some homes, is the division, I mean, you mentioned our Civil War. Sometimes families were divided in our Civil War. Does that happen in theirs, or is it all pretty much religious or cultural?
Well, I can tell you just from stories that I heard that there are divided families. Are there families where there's a soldier and a rebel in the same family? I didn't hear that case, but I did hear occasions where people can't talk politics anymore because different members of the family feel so powerfully about different sides of the conflict. But you mentioned sects. That is S-E-C-T-S, not the way it might normally be mentioned on this particular stage. You mention the sectarian divisions in Syria. I may be telling some of you things that you already know, but there is a minority which is sympathetic but not the same as Shia Muslims, the Alawites, that dominates the country. President Assad is Alawite, his father is Alawite. Many of the elites, not all of them by any means, but many of them are Alawites. And when the rebellion began, it was concentrated among the Sunni Muslims, who are a majority of the country. And part of Assad's strategy to survive has been to play upon the fears of every religious minority in the country. Christians are told, you're going to be slaughtered if these guys take over. Shias are told, you're going to be slaughtered if these guys take over. And Alawites definitely feel embattled. And the rebels, some of them, have given people every reason to be terrified. And it has gotten to the point where, as I moved around Syria, where people are very fearful and have to be very careful about how they talk, it's possible to find people who will tell you, with a tape recorder in front of them, I don't think that Assad is such a great guy. But I can't imagine those other people controlling this country. They will destroy the country. They're destroying it now. And so you have this sectarian division that is deeply troubling, and it's difficult to understand what to do about it now. You will hear people say, everybody got along in the past. I don't actually know how true that is. Sectarian divisions in Islam and various religious divisions go back many centuries, and when you study the history of them, there are periods where they've gotten better and periods where they've gotten immensely worse. But this is a very bad moment, and it affects and is affected by the regional dynamics of that area. You have people saying openly in Syria they understand that they are the scene of what is described as a proxy war between Shia Iran and Sunni Saudi Arabia. There are many other ways to describe that war right now, but it is true that the Saudis are aiding one side and the Iranians are aiding the other, and that's breaking down along sectarian lines, and you have a society that threatens to break apart along sectarian lines.
Reminds me, as you talk about it, a little bit about a couple of places, the former Yugoslavia and Afghanistan, where I served as a diplomat before being at VOA.
Mm-hmm.
Both places where the countries broke down, basically, along sectarian lines, and people that used to be quite friendly, be neighbors and so forth, could no longer be so. Is there evidence that that is what's happening now in Syria? Are neighbors turning on neighbors, or is it, what stage is it at?
I think that there's a degree of that. I think there's a degree of not knowing who exactly you can trust. I think there's also a large mass of people, and we should never forget this. I think this has got to be true in every violent situation, in any political situation in the world. There's a large mass of people who just want it to end. Right. Who are not deeply involved on either side. All they know is artillery shells are landing in their neighborhood and they've had to move to some other location. There's a lot of that. But I'm glad that you mentioned Bosnia. I'm glad that you mentioned Afghanistan, because those are areas where there are different religious groups or different language groups, but they happened, to some extent anyway, to occupy different parts of the country. Ultimately, they were able to come up with a solution in Bosnia, which I will oversimplify by saying they split the country in two, and it's a crazy-looking map. It's hard to believe they were able to find a way to divide the two populations, but they sort of did. I don't know what that map looks like for Syria. I really don't. There's been talk about some potential future in which the Alawites and some other minorities and Assad, maybe if they want to keep him, would run some kind of rump state that would include Damascus and the coastal areas around Tartus and Latakia, these port cities that have a lot of Alawites. But even those areas are not, I am told, I don't have a census in front of me, majority Alawite. They're not. This is a deeply mixed population, and I just don't understand what that map would look like.
So there might be a lot of people, if that were to come to pass, forced out of their homes and forced to move to the other side of the line.
Yeah, and we're nowhere near that, by the way, because Assad, from what I could tell, is not in a position where he needs to contemplate that. There are people who talk about that. People in his inner circle may think about that. I had no access to his inner circle when I was there. But the reality is that at this moment, Assad's forces have been gaining ground rather than losing it. And the rebels are deeply divided and struggling to come up with a strategy. And more than a strategy, and I base this just on the dozens of people, ordinary people that I was able to interview on the government side of the lines. I think the rebels have struggled to come up with some political vision that people can buy. People do not know what the alternative non-Assad future looks like. And I'm not sure anybody in the United States knows exactly what that future looks like, although maybe there's somebody very smart in the State Department or the White House who has a notion. Well,
I'm going to ask you about policy in a second, but there were some very compelling bits of radio that you produced out of Syria, and I want to ask you about one trip you took to Tartus. There were a couple of other occasions too during the series where you describe a kind of surreal situation. Tell us the story of the soldier on the beach.
Oh my goodness, yeah. You go to this city, Tartus. It's a very old city. There are Romanesque kind of ruins there. There's a fortress that resembles the kind of medieval fortress of Tripoli in Libya. There are many, many layers to that city, even though it's not a very large or famous city. And it's a port. And you can go to the water side. There's waterfronts and beach areas, and there's this area where they've put down gigantic rocks. I mean, the tops of the rocks are larger than these speakers in front of me here. And just a giant band of rocks, and they've put plastic picnic tables, plastic tables and chairs with umbrellas on these rocks, and people are sitting around. And so I walked along the beach. It's this beautiful, beautiful spot looking out on the Mediterranean that's like glass, interviewing people. And I started talking with this young brother and sister, and it turned out the brother was a Syrian soldier. He didn't want to tell a foreigner too much about what he did, but he described himself as being someone who was in the army, who has been in combat, and every 6 weeks or whatever it was, he gets a few days off and he comes to Tartus, and he's sitting there on the beach. Now, he would not be the only soldier to have ever had that experience. I mean, you know, Americans have rotated out of combat zones for many, many years, and that must be completely bizarre to them as well to come home, except, you know, if Americans rotate out of Afghanistan, they're leaving the country. Yeah. This guy's in the same country, in this peaceful place that's intensively secured, that has not been touched by the war, that has become a home for hundreds of thousands of refugees from other parts of the country, and he's hanging out on the beach. He's at a resort, and in a couple of days he's going to go back into the war. And I don't know if he was a nice man or a not so nice man, or, as many soldiers I think end up being in situations like that, basically nice people who get drawn into ever more brutal situations and do ever more brutal things.
And in Damascus and some of the other cities you visited, is there an air of normalcy at all in some of the neighborhoods?
In some of the areas, in some of the more affluent areas, in the central areas, yes. But let's just remember that bombardments are loud. I mean, if you're in Damascus, if you're in Homs, if you're in other places like that, there is nowhere that you do not feel and hear the concussions of shell fire. You know, described normal. There was a guy who was with his family. He described this as normal. He lived in Duma, one of the suburbs that I mentioned that gets bombarded periodically. They finally moved their family out. They moved it like a mile out of town or 2 miles out of town. So there's still explosions. We were still close enough to hear small arms fire. Something was burning. There was a giant tower of smoke. You could look out their window and see it. They considered this area safe because stray shells had landed on the other side of the street, but not their side of the street. And they're in this half-built building that had not been finished before the war, and a bunch of refugees have kind of moved in, and they you know, strung electric wires from somewhere, and they didn't have much furniture or whatever. They threw whatever belongings they had into the house. And when you ask this guy what life is like, it's normal. That's normal. That's normal in Syria right now.
That's the new normal.
Yeah.
Any sign of Iranians or Hezbollah?
Let me answer that carefully because of the conditions under which you do meet people. Let me just state it straight out. There are Hezbollah people in Syria. There's no doubt about it. And they have been in different places and doing different things. It appears that at the beginning their presence may have been symbolic. Then it was training. And now it's clear that there are people from Hezbollah who've been fighting on the Syrian side. What I do not actually know is how effective they've been. They arrived with a fearsome reputation. They have been fearsome fighters. They battled against the Israeli army, which is the most powerful military in the region, and have fought the Israelis to a standstill. They have a lot of experience in urban combat. But I do not actually know how effective they've been in taking the offensive. That's the really hard thing about urban combat. I don't want to say it's easy, it's brutal, but it can be done to defend a neighborhood that you know really well when some enemy soldiers come in who don't know the streets really well, and you can fight house to house and you don't mind if the neighborhood is destroyed. You can do that. It's a different thing to take it from somebody else. When I was in Syria, there was a battle raging for a city called Qusair, which was the first place that Hezbollah fighters were known to be directly involved in a significant way. And the provincial governor, who's outside of Qusair in the city of Homs, said to me, "Oh, everything's fine. We've taken the center of Qusair." And I did what you're supposed to do as a correspondent in that situation. Thank you very much, that's great. Can you show me? Because you can't believe anything anybody tells you. You have to see it yourself. And in fact, when someone makes a claim, it is for a reporter an opportunity. Prove it to me. Show me some proof. I would love to see the proof that you've taken Qusair. And he was a nice man in his way, setting aside the fact that he believed that the Masons secretly control the United States, which was a theory that he'd heard from David Duke, who I later learned is a regular guest on Russia Today, Russian television. Anyway, which is maybe where he probably heard it. That's probably so. I mean, there's their last ally. He'd be watching Russia Today. But anyway, he sent me toward Qusair. A couple of guys were sent with me. We went, it was a very revealing journey from what they avoided as much as what we were able to do. We drove toward the city. We could see and hear immense explosions as they pounded the airfield, which it turned out they were taking from the rebels that day. We got within a checkpoint or a few checkpoints of Qusair, and then we were stopped and told we couldn't go on. There's snipers on this road. We climbed to a rooftop. There was still smoke rising over the city of Qusair, so we knew the fight actually was continuing. They couldn't show me that city. They clearly had not taken the city at that point. So I can't tell you that Hezbollah fighters were incredibly effective. I can just tell you that they ended up taking another week or two to take that city. They've talked big about sending Hezbollah fighters north to Aleppo, the largest city in the country, to take that back, but last I've heard that hasn't happened yet.
Steve, we're going to move to Iran in a minute, and then after that, I'm going to open it up for questions to Steve from people in the audience. So be thinking about what you'd like to ask. But before we move to Iran, I can't help putting you on the spot. What should the United States do in Syria? What should President Obama be doing, in your opinion? What's our best policy in a very difficult situation?
Let me start with things that I worry about us doing. There's a book I read some years ago that affected me a lot, H.R. McMaster's Dereliction of Duty. And I almost didn't read it because it's about Vietnam. I'd read a lot of books about Vietnam, and I thought, why do I need one more book? And it turned out to be really revealing because it is this intricate study of a series of decisions that were made that led the United States to get involved in Vietnam. And the insight that McMaster had was that the chief policymakers disagreed. Basically, the generals disagreed with the president about what to do. There were other officials involved, of course. And so instead of taking any particular course, they continually split the difference, half measure, half measure, half measure. You needed to either get in or get out, and they sort of did neither for a very long time and ended up more deeply involved than anybody really wanted to be in a way that no one thought was the wise way to go. So I would hope that's not what the United States is in the very early stages of doing now, where everybody thinks that something ought to be done. Nobody's exactly sure what that thing should be or quite agrees. So I'm a little wary of half measures. Just as a citizen, I mean, when I hear that that the United States is finally beginning to send some weapons to the Syrian rebels, but it's not clear that these are weapons that they don't already have. I mean, they have small arms. I don't fully understand what the end of that policy is. I also don't fully understand how the United States is going to sort through the Syrian rebels. I've been able to meet, not at all a representative sample, a couple of Syrian rebels and sit with them, and in spite of their reputation as horrifying Islamists, these people seemed like rather normal guys who got excited by the Arab Spring and the uprisings in other countries and wanted that for their own country. And the one young man, he was 24, he told a story. I can't prove all his story is true, but he seemed believable. Said that he was protesting. He finally got arrested at a checkpoint. He got taken off to prison. He spent 6 months in prison. He was tortured. He was shown dead bodies. And he vowed that if he ever got out, which he did, that he would join the Free Syrian Army. And now he says he's a trigger puller for the Syrian army. He's got a gun, although he says he's not a good shot. You have people like that. And you also have people like Jabhat al-Nusra, the extremist group. You have rebels like the guy who was videotaped eating an organ of a Syrian soldier. I mean, there are some horrifying people. And honestly, even if they were the most honorable people, they're fighting a war, and there's video everywhere, and video will show them doing brutal things. The thing that I do not understand is how the United States will pick the moderate rebels and leave the others alone. I think that's just, it's really hard to do, and it's not just knowing who the moderates are. Look at the experience that the US has had in Pakistan. Look at the experience the United States has had in Afghanistan. When you start picking among different factions, one of the things that happens is you discredit the very people that you want to support. They find your support to be a political liability, and you end up with Hamid Karzai running around doing counterproductive things and denouncing you all the time, which is what the United States has in Afghanistan. And I don't actually know how to avoid that situation in Syria. I don't know the answer also to why the United States has not attempted some of the seemingly cost-free measures that they've taken in places like Libya. But I'm mindful that nothing can be taken at the beginning, can be presumed to be cost-free. If the Libya intervention had not worked out, the U.S. was in for more.
I'm just going to push back at you a little bit.
All right, because I haven't answered your question.
Well, and because doing nothing is not cost-free either. Mm-hmm. There are people dying in their thousands in Syria right now, and we are not doing anything to help them. We're not doing anything to address what's going on beyond saying we'll send arms. And I suppose perhaps
calling for a peace conference.
Calling for a peace conference is laudable. It's absolutely the right thing to do. Try to get the two sides to a table. Very, very difficult. May not work. Worth trying. Absolutely.
Well, let me speak in practical terms.
But I do think there's a moral question for those who say we're not going to do anything, as well as one for those who want to.
Let me answer you in practical terms. Without being an advocate for a policy, let's just think in terms of practicalities. Mm-hmm. If you want the shooting to stop, you have to do something practical that weakens Assad. Because even though they're talking about a peace conference, any minute now, any day now, as a citizen, as a layman, as a non-diplomat, I don't even understand what that peace conference is about at this moment, because Assad's forces can at least portray themselves as being strong enough to weather this. They've still got an ally or two. They've still got some money somehow. Their currency has collapsed. I don't know how they're paying people, but they've mostly been paying people. They've still got an army that's functioning. Yeah. They've got a slice of the population that's terrified of the enemy and is willing to support Assad. And I don't know that there is enough pressure on this man yet to make him step down, or to make someone step him down. Is that the proper construction for that?
Well, I understand what you mean.
Yeah.
Let's move quickly to Iran and spend a little less time on it and then open it up. But journalists don't get to, the American journalists very seldom go to Iran. I've traveled all over the world. I've been almost everywhere. I have not been to Iran. I'm incredibly jealous of you.
They said they missed you.
No. How open?
When is David Ensor coming?
Yeah, right. Good. Well, no, I hope to come one day.
Yeah.
And by the way, in Kabul, while I was there, I ran into a lot of young Iranian Americans who were working at NGOs or law firms or whatever, and they were perched there in the Farsi Dari-speaking world, waiting for the fall. They're expecting it. And they said, most pro-American country on earth, Iran. Was it that, first of all? And
how I mean, people welcome you on a really basic level. They're really interested. They're really interested to see you. People are curious about me almost anywhere. I tend to go places I don't fit in, really easily. I don't blend into the landscape necessarily. But in Syria, everyone would ask if I was a Russian. Rus? No, American. Oh, okay. They were less excited. Iranians are really interested. I mean, I agree with that much. There is an affinity between the two countries. There are constant analogies to draw. I mean, the Iranians have devised this system of government that has a series of checks and balances that make it impossible to get anything done.
Except maybe building a bomb, right?
Have we ever heard that story before? Except maybe building a bomb, yes. Or thinking about it, insisting on a nuclear program. They deny, of course, that they're building a bomb. But there are so many things that the way that the two countries think, I mean, the way that the two governments think. You have a government that one of its foundational principles is resistance to the United States. And I think that causes them to think about the United States a lot. On election day, June 14th in Iran, I went to Friday prayers at Tehran University. This is a big event. It's a weekly event in Tehran. There's a gigantic metal shed. Thousands, if not tens of thousands of people come. People like me can go watch. A senior cleric, one famous person or another will show up. 4 years ago, I got to go, and Rafsanjani, the former president, just showed up unannounced and delivered the sermon. Today it was this time it was another senior cleric. And so many elements of this scene were about America. First, a large part of the ritual is that someone, either the main speaker or someone before, denounces the United States, and then everyone chants, Mark Bar America, Mark Bar America, death to America, death to America. And then on this particular occasion, after one of these just ocean chants, we're talking about thousands of people chanting this, a man who's standing up there in this kind of press area where people like me go to watch the whole thing, comes up to me and says, "We like Americans."
Funny way to show it.
Yeah, well, but I think both of those things are true. And the guy ended up, I mean, I didn't know who he was, but I wondered what his political position was going to be, but he starts talking a little more, and he starts talking a little more, and he says, what is your opinion of the future of relations between Iran and the United States? Which is not an opinion that I really want to give while I'm in Iran, to be honest with you. Or here, David.
Oh, okay.
No, we can talk about that. I'm joking, I'm joking.
Yeah.
But he says, what is your opinion? And I tried to say something non-committal. And this guy says, I think it's going to be very, very bad. Unless Rouhani, who was the moderate candidate, the most moderate candidate who was allowed to run and who was still running in the election, wins. And then he thought there was hope. And it turns out that the people did elect the most moderate candidate that they had. A man who very clearly said in his campaign that he wanted better relations with the West, that he wanted more personal freedom inside the country, that he thought that the previous Iranian administration had screwed up its relationship with the United States, had done badly in the nuclear negotiations with the United States. People voted for this guy, as far as we can tell. Those were the official results anyway, and they appear to have at least taken time to count this time. And so you have this bizarre situation where there is the surface of hatred of America. And let's be honest, if we go back through history, the United States has given Iran reasons. And you have these gigantic billboards, you know, of bizarre things done with American flags. And the speaker gets up finally at Friday prayers, and he tries to make an argument about how Iran's democracy is infinitely superior to American democracy. My first thought was, I really wish we had a better democracy so that I could brag about it more. But my second thought was, wow, this guy is thinking a lot about the United States. He actually doesn't have a very well-informed view of the United States. He'd misdescribed the United States and its democracy, sadly. But I thought, he must really be interested. If I met that cleric, You must really be interested in us. I think you think about us a lot more than Americans think about you.
That's true in a lot of places in the world, isn't it?
Yes.
Tell me, Rouhani's election, do you see it as a setback for Khamenei or actually an advance?
I don't think any analyst, no matter how brilliant, can tell you for sure if that election was managed to the result that Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, wanted, or if it got a little bit out of his control. But allow me to speculate.
That's what I asked for.
That it may have been an unintentional advance for the supreme leader of Iran, because he may have preferred some other candidate with a different point of view to win. Rouhani's views are views that he's learned to accept someone expressing, but that he's also publicly said he's very skeptical that they can work. He doesn't think that his country can reach accommodation with the United States. He doesn't trust the United States. I still think it was an advance for Iran's supreme leader, however, because the system had profoundly lost credibility. The election in 2009 was a disaster. They had to have massive, massive security on the streets, layers and layers and layers of security on the streets to keep people under control. And this time, there was a result that people believed, which restored some credibility to the system. Yeah. And people who were angry, I only got to spend a week there. They limit your time if they let you in at all. At the beginning of the week, people were angry. And they were willing to say so in spite of the fear, in spite of the surveillance. They were angry. By election day, people were happy. There was this festive mood. People woke up that day and just decided they were going to vote for Rouhani, and then they got Rouhani. There's an immensely better mood, and I bet Karim Sajidpour is an excellent analyst of these affairs. Speculates that if you had a reliable poll of Khamenei's approval rating, it has probably soared.
Yeah. So one last question before I ask others to ask questions.
Right.
I mean, I gather that almost all Iranians are in favor of their nuclear program, that there's not much opposition to it. At least we don't really know. We can't do reliable polling, but one gets the impression from what I read that most people in Iran think it should be allowed to have its nuclear program, which of course they say is only for energy and not for bombs, but a lot of them realize it's capable of doing both once you get to that level of enriched uranium or plutonium being available. Again, I'm going to ask you to speculate.
Sure.
What are the chances for change? Do you think Iran might give up, open up for surprise inspections at any time, thereby relieving the West's concern about the possibility of a breakout and a nuclear weapon? Do you see that as a possibility?
I actually do.
Not?
I actually do, and there are a number of reasons for that. One is that this election exposed a divide in Iran's elites. I mean, in the end, 6 candidates were on the ballot on election day. There were 8 until shortly before. They were all carefully chosen people. They were the ones who were allowed to run. They were the ones with acceptable views. So they were clearly the representatives of the governing elite. And even among those 8 with their narrow views, there proved in televised debates to be really sharp divisions about how to handle the negotiation with the United States. And you had very conservative people like Velayati, who's the advisor, the foreign policy advisor to the supreme leader, basically saying this problem could be managed far better than you're doing it. And he's pointing a finger effectively at Jalali, who was another candidate who's been the nuclear negotiator. He's basically suggesting this is a problem that we can massage, that we can deal with through diplomacy, that we can make go away, that there's some possible accommodation. It is not an irreconcilable difference. That was the argument that some in Iran's elites were making. Another thing that makes me think it's possible that there could be some movement, some improvement, is that sanctions in Iran, US-led sanctions, are extremely painful right now. The economy is a mess. The sanctions, according to analysts, are not the sole reason, but they're a big reason. They're what people blame, and people understand that the collapse in their currency the loss of a lot of income, the loss of life savings, the craziness of their economy right now, the fact that people have to go in this death to America country and change their currency into dollars so that their savings do not vanish. People understand that all of that is happening because of the nuclear program, and they are asking, you know, is this really necessary? I think you're right. I think most people naturally, why shouldn't we have a nuclear program? You know, most people probably are right there, but they are understanding that there's a cost to it.
Yep.
And I think that does create at least a possibility.
Great. Let's open it up now. And those who are down here, if you put your hands up, I'll recognize you, and someone will come to you with a microphone. Those of you who are up there need to go to there, over that side.
Is Snoop Dogg here tonight?
The lady with the microphone right there. And let's get some questions going for Steve here. Anyone ready right now? There's a hand up there.
Hello?
You go to the gentleman right there. We start there. Could you identify yourself also and make it a question?
Named Patrick Freeman. I'm from Laguna Beach, California. I served in the infantry in Vietnam. My question is this, the real simple part is, what do the Iranians think the Israelis are going to do if they get nuclear weapons? I mean, the Israelis have said, we're going to bomb them back to the Stone Age.
I don't actually know what the Iranians think Israel will do. I think the Iranians are aware, it's got to be part of their calculations, that Israel has a strong military, that Israel can't pound Iran the way the United States could theoretically pound Iran, but that Israel could do them some damage. And honestly, I mean, you see them when periodically a new nuclear facility is discovered, it's buried somewhere. So what precisely do they think about that? I don't know, but they're aware of Israel's power.
Hello?
Maybe this young man here in the blue shirt? And you have someone up there next, okay? All right, we'll go to you next and then to the young man in blue, please.
Back to Syria, we didn't hear any mention of Russia. Could you speak if you had any implications of their involvement?
Did you see any Russian weapons?
I didn't, well, I mean, yes, but you see those everywhere in the world. You see Kalashnikovs. It would be, I mean, there was news about Russia approving, you know, some missile system that seemed like it was still some time away from being deployed. It seems to me that Russia's biggest role right now is as a diplomatic friend. Russia helps to ensure that there is not a United Nations front against Syria. Russia is the country that's still willing to put a flight on the board that goes from Moscow to Damascus, so the airport is still theoretically open. I don't actually know, and let me not make up things about Russia's financial or other support. There are reports that Iran has supported Syria substantially financially. Maybe Russia is as well. Maybe someone here knows more than I. They're a vital ally for them just because they're one of the last allies left. And I will also say, even though I did not see Russians in the country, so many people at so many checkpoints thought I was Russian that I thought maybe some Russians had been through before me. They do have a naval base in Tartus, so it would make sense they would.
Okay, this young man here, and then the lady over there. Say who you are, too, please.
Oh, sorry, I'm Adam Zacher from New York. And when you were talking about Syria, you mentioned that the U.S. should not do half measures, that we should not try and be a house divided and go in halfway and then halfway again. And then when you were talking about Iran, you said they were also divided, and Hezbollah is not really doing that well. Do you see Iran as doing half measures?
Let me push back slightly on the characterizations of my own remarks, and forgive me for doing this. I think the half measures are fine if they actually work, or even work halfway. The danger is ineffective measures. I think Iran is pretty deeply into the Syrian war at the moment. Hezbollah is an Iran-sponsored organization, and they're going all out in ways that are causing all kinds of political problems for Hezbollah inside its base, Lebanon. And you also have the Iranians reportedly pouring money into Syria at a time when Iran's economy is a mess, and they surely could use that money better. I don't know what more Iran could do without actually entering the war, which of course would be extraordinarily risky and could cause disasters beyond anyone's imagining.
So let's take one from up there now, and then we'll go to the lady down here.
Maren Obernar from New York. Could you talk a little bit about what's going on in Turkey, an important NATO ally, and perhaps how much of what's going on there is being affected by the Syrian situation?
I'm not an expert in Turkey. I've only passed through on my way to cover other stories. It's kind of cool to be in Istanbul right now. I was there on the way to Iran, and you can go down that, is it Istiklal Street? There's a, someone will know. Who's saying it? Thank you. And it's this great pedestrian street in the middle of Istanbul. And I mean, it's kind of like reporting from your hotel in Syria. I mean, you just stand on this street in Istanbul and the protest comes by. Just give 5 minutes and a protest comes by. I'm no expert. I know the country is under greater pressure because of the Syrian situation and honestly the Iraq situation before. It, to me, is a fascinating circumstance because you have a democratically elected government that is being protested against as if it's Hosni Mubarak. And that is a weird, weird situation. In the end, I don't know where it goes. I don't see how you topple a democratically elected government through popular protest. But clearly the government is under pressure.
Indeed. The lady down here, please, next. In the dark blue, or well, okay, yeah. Well, I meant the lady in blue, but
Hi, I'm
you both got questions.
Shireen El-Feki, I'm from Cairo. I write about the other kind of sex
in
the
okay.
Arab region. But my question is political. Talking about Cairo, tomorrow, for example, huge pushback against the Islamists. And I wonder if, I mean, there is talk that the failure of the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafiyin in Egypt will have impacts on the prospects for political Islam across the Arab region. So I'm wondering if you're seeing any of this impact yet in Syria. Is the failure of the Islamists in Egypt playing into the hands of Assad yet?
Allow me to say, based on my limited observations, specifically your question, no. The Syrians have so much to worry about in front of them, I don't think they're thinking about Egypt very much anymore. It kind of fades into the background. As in regards to their Islamists, are people saying the Islamists will be as bad as Morsi? I think people in Syria are fearful that their Islamists would be infinitely worse than Morsi. That Morsi would be a nice guy compared to someone eating a liver or being affiliated with Al-Qaeda. How real those fears are, I mean, if the rebels were to come to power, I don't actually know. But the fears have been raised to such an extent in Syria that Morsi, I don't even think, would be particularly scary. Does that answer your question? Yeah, he's got, who knows, he can go there and be a popular politician.
Over there, the gentleman with his hand up.
Bob Engler from San Diego. I don't really understand why the Sunnis and the Shiites are slaughtering and killing each other. I really don't. How much of it is religious in terms of Islamist extremism versus much more liberalism, and how much of it is just plain political corruption and power? My group gets power, your group doesn't.
Well, there was this guy named Ali in the 600s AD. No, I'm just kidding. I think that, let me say yes to all of your questions. You begin with this religious divide that goes back centuries. It becomes an ethnic and cultural divide. It becomes a kind of prejudice. It's really remarkable. I've remembered for years spending time in Pakistan and being driven on a long drive by this very, very nice, sweet man, but he was a Sunni. And he just started talking about Shias and how they were like stupid and dirty and had all these horrible rituals. And he was talking about Shia Muslims the way that a really prejudiced person would talk about African Americans in the United States. And so you have people that, where their division has gone beyond some, 1,400-year-old theological debate, and it's become just this kind of visceral divide. But you also alluded to politics, and that is a large part of this. Vali Nasser, who's a brilliant scholar, whose books I recommend to you. I know some people disagreed with his trashing of the Obama administration, but he's a very smart guy. He has written fascinatingly about this, about the fact that if you go back over the past 13 or 1400 years, there are centuries where Sunnis and Shias appear to live together in relative harmony. And then they widen apart again. And a large part of that has to do with political leadership. What are politicians doing to drive people apart, to drive supporters to them? And the dynamic right now in country after country after country is really bad. And I think it's one of the reasons that people are so worried about Syria, because Syria, having become a sectarian situation, intensifies sectarian feelings in other countries and creates more situations for more bad politicians to take advantage of if they will.
How about the lady who right there in pink?
Judith Libby from Indianapolis, Indiana.
All right, my hometown, Carmel, Indiana.
I was
no
wondering,
applause for Indianapolis? Come on.
I work with Roland.
It's like Aspen without the mountains.
I work with Roland Inskeep. He might be related to you.
I'm sorry, say that again?
I said I worked with Roland Inskeep, who might be related to you.
That would be my dad.
I know he is.
All right.
Anyway, my question is, in the largest context, as America has begun to withdraw from first Iraq and then Afghanistan, how does that affect, or does it have any effect, in the turmoil that's happening now?
Which turmoil do you mean? There's so many.
Well, all of the Middle, but Syria, this is what you were talking about. Is there any connection between our withdrawing and the sort of empowering of this?
I think to a degree there is. I mean, there are a lot of people, including diplomats and leaders from the region, who will say to you, America is in retreat, we see America is in retreat, and that affects all of our strategic calculations. So I don't want to entirely dismiss that effect. It's a powerful effect to see the United States withdrawing. At the same time, America remains immense in people's minds, as we were discussing before with Iran. America remains an immense player throughout the region. And so has America's influence dropped away? Has America lost credibility? I mean, I don't know about that. I mean, there were people who don't necessarily believe anything the United States says anyway, but they think about the United States and they react to the United States in different ways. You could ask, well, would Iraq be more stable? Iraq's getting really bad again. Would Iraq be more stable if U.S. troops were still there? Maybe, but there was a really nasty sectarian civil war while our troops were there. So it could be, you could envision a scenario where there were still 40,000 American troops in Baghdad and all the killing that's taking place now is going on. Different situations affect different countries, but it's so complicated, I don't know that it's so simple to say, the U.S. is withdrawn, everything's going down the tubes.
I think in Iran, the United States, as you were saying, looms so large in the way they think about the world. It's just an interesting note. I lead Voice of America. We broadcast in Farsi on television in Iran, and 20% of the adult population of Iran watches a VOA television show at least once a week.
Right.
There's a similar number for BBC television in Farsi. So there's a large number of people very interested in hearing news from the outside world. They don't believe they get a straight story from their own broadcasts. And they're very, very interested, particularly in the United States and what it thinks. We've got time for this gentleman here, and maybe one more after that, depending on how long.
Hi, Oliver Garfield from Aspen, Colorado. Saying that Syria is a proxy war for Iran and Saudi Arabia, who are the power elements in Saudi Arabia that are allowing the arms and the influence? Is it the royal family, the Wahhabis? Or
Wow, I don't fully understand. I don't even begin to understand the power dynamics of Saudi Arabia. I just know that Saudi money has gone that way, and Qatari money has gone that way. And maybe David can answer that question better than I. With his grad, have you been to Saudi Arabia? I mean,
I have, but I don't think I'd want to dive in. It's you know, it's complicated. It's complicated.
How about if we actually take a question at this highfalutin forum and say we don't have a clue?
Yeah, we don't know.
All right.
But it's a good question.
It is.
Do we have one more up there? Sir.
Hi. How effective do you think the coordinated American and Israeli cyber attack on the Iranian nuclear program was? And did you see it play out in the recent Iranian election at all?
I don't know how effective it was. U.S. officials thought that they did some damage and were angry when some details of it were revealed, and apparently now that's going to be a subject of an investigation, or has been for some time. It didn't play out in the election at all. It was very funny because the people, I mean, inside Iran, the people who are presumed to be messing with, dealing with cyber attacks and messing with people's email and monitoring communications are the Iranians. I had a very strange moment, actually, when I was in both Syria and Iran, because you're very tense about invasions. You're very tense about your email being read. You're very tense about your calls being listened to. You're very tense about hackers using your equipment as a Trojan horse to get into your company in some fashion. And so we were taking extraordinary measures over this incredibly slow internet to make sure that our communications were as secure as we could possibly make them. And I was thinking about it, and after a while I realized I'm like doing this VPN and doing these other things that I can do, and taking all this time and spending extra hours to make sure that no one illicitly reads my communications until they get back to the United States.
It's metadata. They do metadata.
Oh, metadata. Excuse me. That's right. And so in any case, I mean, the internet security is on everybody's minds. The Iranians seem to have some tools of their own and some sophistications of their own and some powers of their own. And they would, it seemed, no one can confirm this, but it seemed, speed up and slow down the internet at will to try to control communications within their own country. And they seemed at least as worried about that as they were about any particular attack on their nuclear program.
Yeah, I can tell you that in the run-up to the elections, we have a lot of material on the internet that in Farsi, and it slowed down to a crawl, and it was very, very difficult to get new information onto the websites and onto the mobile apps and all the rest of it that Voice of America transmits in Farsi. Clearly, it had been slowed down, sort of governed down by the government. If there's one more short question, lady right there.
Yes, no.
Yeah. Just a sec, yeah.
Hello, Lisa Epifani from Washington, D.C. What do you think the Chinese government's opinion is of the U.S. administration's behavior towards Syria?
Towards Syria? Wow, I thought you were going to go in so many other directions before Syria. This is all speculation, but if you're the Chinese government, you have your formal position that countries are independent countries and they should, manage their own internal affairs. There is no philosophical level on which the Chinese would love what the United States is just any involvement in Syria, limited though it may be. At the same time, if you are a Chinese strategist, if you are a cynic, you may wonder if it is helpful in some long-term way to have the United States gradually entangled in another mess. That may not be I'm not saying that there is a single Chinese official who has that view. I'm saying that's one way that people may think of it. In fact, let me mention that as I hear people speculate about Syria, one of the questions that people raise is who's really going to get stuck there? Who's really going to get burned? we have this fear that we'll get dragged into another endless war. But then you'll hear people speculate, maybe it's going to be Iran's turn to get dragged into this endless war and spending more and more money to support an ally that they really can't afford to support. It's a reminder, whether you're cynical or not, that it's a mess. It's a dangerous mess that could damage a lot of the world. And in the end, no matter how cynical you are, I doubt that there's any strategist or diplomat in any country, including China, who in the end would want it to just go on and on and on.
Stephen, on that note, on behalf of all of us, thank you for making the trips, and thank you for your comments tonight.
Thank you. Thanks for the questions. And thanks for VOA.